Lil Durk's federal case just took another major turn, and this time, prosecutors are pushing back hard against his defense. In a newly filed court response, the federal government says Durk's legal team has it completely wrong, arguing there has been no violation of his constitutional right to a speedy trial and insisting that all of the charges should be tried together in one case. According to prosecutors, this isn't about delaying justice, it's about presenting the full picture of what they describe as an ongoing racketeering conspiracy backed by extensive digital evidence, cooperating witnesses, and guilty pleas from co-defendants. The filing also addresses one of the biggest arguments raised by the defense, the request to separate the newer charges from the original murder-for-hire allegations. But the government says splitting the case would confuse the jury, force witnesses to testify multiple times, and ignore how prosecutors believe the alleged crimes are connected. They also point to thousands of gigabytes of digital evidence, text messages, burner phones, and additional investigative work completed after the original arrests as justification for the superseding indictment. So, is this filing a major setback for Lil Durk's defense, or is it simply another chapter in what is expected to be one of the biggest federal hip-hop trials in recent memory? In today's video, we're breaking down the government's explosive response, separating the legal facts from the online rumors, and explaining what this latest filing could mean as both sides continue preparing for trial. Let's get into it. The federal battle surrounding Lil Durk has entered another critical stage, and this latest court filing could shape the direction of the entire case. Federal prosecutors have officially responded to the defense's motion asking the judge to either separate certain charges into different trials or dismiss portions of the superseding indictment altogether. Instead of backing down, the government is taking an aggressive position, arguing that the defense has misunderstood both the facts and the law. Prosecutors insist there has been no violation of Lil Durk's constitutional right to a speedy trial and say every charge belongs in a single trial because they are all connected through what they describe as an alleged racketeering enterprise. This filing represents one of the strongest responses from the government so far, making it clear that prosecutors have no intention of changing course before trial. One of the biggest issues in this legal battle is the defense's argument that the newer charges should be separated from the original allegations. Lil Durk's attorneys contend that the government's decision to file a superseding indictment has delayed the case and interfered with his right to a speedy trial. They argue that the original murder-for-hire allegations could have proceeded without waiting for additional charges to be added months later. However, federal prosecutors completely reject that argument. According to the government's response, the investigation never stopped after the initial arrests. Instead, agents continued reviewing evidence, executing search warrants, analyzing digital devices, and interviewing witnesses. Prosecutors argue that as new evidence was uncovered, they had both the authority and the responsibility to bring additional charges supported by that evidence. The filing explains that investigators reviewed an enormous amount of digital material collected during the investigation. Prosecutors state that approximately 59 digital devices and online accounts were seized, including dozens obtained after the original arrests. They also claim investigators analyzed roughly 4.5 terabytes of digital evidence, an amount that would require months of forensic examination. According to the government, this ongoing review uncovered additional communications, electronic records, and other evidence that expanded their understanding of the alleged criminal enterprise. Prosecutors argue that this is exactly why superseding indictments exist, allowing investigators to present new charges when additional evidence emerges during an active investigation rather than rushing an incomplete case into court. Another major point raised by prosecutors involves the alleged efforts to conceal evidence. According to the filing, investigators recovered text messages in which members of the alleged enterprise discussed deleting conversations and starting new message threads. The government also claims there were instructions explaining how to permanently remove deleted messages from cloud storage. Prosecutors argue these communications demonstrate an awareness of law enforcement's investigation and an effort to prevent evidence from being recovered. The filing further alleges that multiple burner phones were used throughout the conspiracy and that some devices were discarded after violent incidents in an attempt to avoid detection. Whether these allegations ultimately withstand scrutiny at trial remains to be seen, but prosecutors clearly believe they strengthen their overall case. Federal prosecutors also rely heavily on the cooperation of several co-defendants who have entered guilty pleas. According to the government's filing, some of these individuals have admitted under oath to participating in violent crimes connected to the alleged enterprise. Prosecutors argue that these admissions provide important evidence supporting the broader conspiracy allegations. They also point to anticipated testimony from cooperating witnesses, saying that their accounts will help explain how different events fit together. Because of this, the government argues that conducting separate trials would force witnesses to testify repeatedly, create unnecessary risks, and prevent jurors from hearing the complete story surrounding the alleged racketeering conspiracy. Perhaps the government's strongest practical argument concerns witness safety and judicial efficiency. Prosecutors tell the court that cooperating witnesses have already faced threats and intimidation, making it even more important to avoid multiple trials. They argue that requiring these witnesses to appear more than once would increase security concerns while placing additional burdens on the court, federal marshals, and everyone involved in protecting those witnesses. For that reason, prosecutors insist that a single trial is the fairest and most efficient approach. As this legal battle continues, the judge will now have to determine whether the defense's arguments justify separating the case or whether the government's position will prevail as both sides move closer to one of the most closely watched federal trials involving a major figure in hip-hop. While the defense argues that the superseding indictment unfairly delayed the case, prosecutors insist the timeline tells a very different story. In their response, the government outlines a series of continuances that were granted throughout the proceedings, arguing that many of those delays were either requested or agreed to by members of the defense team. According to the filing, the court repeatedly found that the case was unusually complex because of the number of defendants, the volume of evidence, and the nature of the alleged conspiracy. Prosecutors argue that these findings allowed the court to exclude certain periods of time under the Speedy Trial Act, meaning those delays do not count as unconstitutional violations. From the government's perspective, the defense cannot now claim that the same delays justify dismissing or separating the charges when many of those scheduling decisions were already approved by the court. The government also addresses the argument that prosecutors intentionally waited to bring the newer allegations. According to the filing, there was no effort to gain a tactical advantage over the defense. Instead, prosecutors say the investigation continued to develop after the initial arrests because agents were still collecting and analyzing evidence. Federal investigators reportedly executed additional search warrants, reviewed newly obtained digital devices, and continued interviewing witnesses throughout the investigation. Prosecutors argue that bringing new charges after discovering additional evidence is a normal part of federal criminal investigations, especially in large conspiracy cases involving multiple defendants. Rather than rushing incomplete allegations into court, they claim they waited until the evidence supported the broader indictment before presenting it to the grand jury. Another significant portion of the filing focuses on communications that investigators allegedly recovered during the investigation. Prosecutors claim they uncovered messages discussing suspected informants, along with conversations encouraging members of the alleged enterprise to delete message threads and create new ones. According to the government, one exchange allegedly instructed participants not only to erase conversations from their phones but also to permanently clear deleted messages from cloud storage. Prosecutors argue these conversations demonstrate efforts to conceal communications from investigators. They also allege that burner phones were routinely used before being discarded after certain incidents, making it more difficult for law enforcement to reconstruct communications. These allegations are expected to become an important part of the government's presentation if the case proceeds to trial. The filing also references guilty pleas entered by co-defendants in connection with other alleged acts described by prosecutors. According to the government, those individuals admitted under oath to participating in crimes that prosecutors believe were connected to the broader racketeering enterprise. Federal attorneys argue these admissions strengthen their conspiracy allegations because they provide testimony from people who allegedly participated in the events themselves. At trial, prosecutors expect cooperating witnesses to explain how different incidents are connected and why they believe the alleged crimes should not be viewed as isolated events. Defense attorneys will have the opportunity to challenge the credibility of those witnesses through cross-examination, particularly if cooperation agreements or reduced sentences become relevant during testimony. One issue that receives considerable attention in the government's response is witness protection. Prosecutors argue that several cooperating witnesses have already faced intimidation or threats related to the case. Because of those concerns, they believe conducting multiple trials would unnecessarily increase security risks by requiring witnesses to testify more than once. According to the filing, repeating testimony across separate proceedings would place additional burdens on witnesses, federal marshals, court personnel, and everyone responsible for maintaining courtroom security. Prosecutors contend that a single trial would reduce those risks while also preventing inconsistent verdicts that could arise if different juries heard overlapping evidence. They argue that judicial efficiency and witness safety both support keeping every defendant and every charge together before one jury. As the case moves forward, the judge will ultimately decide whether the government's arguments outweigh the defense's request to sever the charges. For now, this latest filing makes one thing unmistakably clear: federal prosecutors remain confident that the superseding indictment was legally justified and that the investigation continued to uncover evidence long after the original arrests were made. The defense is expected to continue challenging both the government's legal reasoning and the strength of its evidence, setting the stage for additional courtroom battles before a jury is ever selected. With millions of pages of records, extensive digital evidence, multiple cooperating witnesses, and serious constitutional questions still being debated, the legal fight surrounding Lil Durk is far from over. Every new filing provides another piece of the puzzle, and the court's upcoming decisions could have a significant impact on how one of the most closely watched federal cases in hip-hop ultimately unfolds. As the government's response continues, prosecutors devote considerable attention to explaining why they believe the alleged racketeering enterprise cannot be separated from the murder-for-hire allegations. According to the filing, every count in the superseding indictment is connected through what prosecutors describe as a common pattern of criminal activity involving the same alleged organization. From the government's perspective, presenting only selected charges to a jury would leave out important context that explains why investigators believe certain events occurred. Prosecutors argue that evidence relating to the alleged enterprise is necessary for jurors to understand the relationships between the defendants, the alleged motive behind various incidents, and the government's overall theory of the case. Because of that, they maintain that severing the charges would create an incomplete picture and could lead to unnecessary confusion during trial. The filing also responds to the defense's claim that adding new charges after the original indictment unfairly changed the case. Prosecutors argue that federal investigations often continue long after arrests are made, particularly in complex conspiracy cases involving multiple defendants and large amounts of digital evidence. According to the government, investigators were still processing electronic devices, obtaining records through search warrants, and reviewing communications months after the initial arrests. They argue that the law allows prosecutors to return to the grand jury with additional charges when new evidence is uncovered. Rather than viewing the superseding indictment as an unusual development, prosecutors describe it as a routine step that reflects the continued progress of an active investigation. They insist the timing was driven by evidence, not by any effort to disadvantage the defense. One of the more notable portions of the filing involves the government's description of communications allegedly recovered during the investigation. Prosecutors claim they identified messages discussing suspected informants and conversations encouraging individuals to remove digital evidence. According to the filing, some communications allegedly instructed members to delete message threads entirely and permanently erase deleted files stored in cloud accounts. The government argues that these alleged actions demonstrate an effort to conceal information from investigators. Prosecutors also claim that certain individuals frequently relied on temporary mobile devices, commonly referred to as burner phones, and allegedly disposed of them after particular events. While the defense will have an opportunity to challenge both the authenticity and interpretation of these communications, prosecutors clearly believe this evidence supports their broader allegations concerning obstruction and concealment. Federal attorneys also emphasize the importance of testimony from cooperating witnesses. According to the filing, several individuals have already admitted guilt in related criminal proceedings and provided statements under oath concerning their own conduct. Prosecutors argue that these admissions are significant because they come from people who allegedly participated in events connected to the broader investigation. They maintain that these witnesses can provide first-hand accounts regarding planning, communications, and the relationships between various defendants. At the same time, the credibility of cooperating witnesses will almost certainly become a major issue if the case proceeds to trial. Defense attorneys are expected to examine whether any witness received benefits in exchange for cooperation, including reduced sentences or favorable plea agreements, matters that jurors commonly consider when evaluating testimony. Another argument presented by the government concerns efficiency within the federal court system. Prosecutors contend that conducting two separate trials involving many of the same witnesses and much of the same evidence would consume substantially more judicial resources. According to the filing, the court would likely hear overlapping testimony, review identical exhibits, and require witnesses to travel and testify multiple times. Prosecutors argue that one comprehensive trial would avoid unnecessary duplication while allowing a single jury to evaluate all relevant evidence together. They also point out that inconsistent verdicts could become a possibility if different juries considered different portions of the same alleged conspiracy. For those reasons, the government believes judicial economy strongly favors keeping the entire indictment together instead of dividing it into separate proceedings. The government's response concludes by urging the court to deny the defense's request and allow the case to proceed under the current superseding indictment. Prosecutors maintain that they acted within the law throughout the investigation, that the additional charges were supported by evidence developed after the original arrests, and that no constitutional violation has occurred. They argue that the defense has not demonstrated actual prejudice resulting from the timing of the indictment or the scheduling of the trial. Ultimately, the judge will determine whether those arguments are persuasive enough to reject the request for severance. Until that decision is made, both sides will continue preparing for what promises to be one of the most closely followed federal criminal trials involving a major hip-hop artist. Regardless of how the court rules on these pretrial motions, the legal issues raised in this filing are likely to influence the strategy of both the prosecution and the defense as the case moves toward its next important stage. Beyond the legal arguments over trial dates and procedural issues, this latest filing gives a clearer picture of how federal prosecutors intend to present their case if it reaches a jury. Rather than treating each allegation as an isolated event, the government continues to frame the entire investigation as one connected conspiracy. Prosecutors argue that every piece of evidence, from digital communications to witness testimony, contributes to a larger narrative that explains the alleged actions of the defendants over several years. Whether that argument ultimately persuades a jury is a question for trial, but at this stage the government's objective is clear. It wants the judge to view the indictment as one unified case instead of a collection of unrelated incidents. That position remains central to nearly every argument made throughout the response. The government also spends time defending the pace of its investigation. According to prosecutors, cases involving multiple defendants, extensive electronic evidence, and allegations of organized criminal activity naturally require more time than ordinary criminal prosecutions. Investigators reportedly had to examine dozens of electronic devices, recover data from numerous online accounts, analyze thousands of communications, and compare digital records with witness statements. Prosecutors argue that this process could not be completed overnight and that continuing the investigation after the initial arrests was both necessary and expected. They reject any suggestion that the government intentionally delayed the case for strategic reasons, maintaining instead that every significant development was driven by newly discovered evidence and the normal progression of a large federal investigation. Another point emphasized in the filing is the importance of digital evidence. Modern federal investigations often rely heavily on electronic records, and prosecutors suggest this case is no exception. According to the government's response, investigators collected text messages, account information, cloud-based data, photographs, videos, and other electronic materials that allegedly support their theory of the case. Prosecutors believe these records help establish timelines, identify communications between individuals, and provide context for other evidence gathered during the investigation. Digital evidence has become increasingly significant in complex criminal prosecutions because it can often be compared with witness testimony, phone records, travel information, and other documentation to build a more complete picture of events. The defense, however, is expected to closely examine how this evidence was collected, preserved, and interpreted before trial. The filing also highlights the government's belief that testimony from cooperating witnesses will play a major role during the proceedings. Prosecutors indicate that some individuals have already accepted responsibility for their own actions and are expected to testify regarding events described in the indictment. Such testimony could help explain conversations, relationships between defendants, and the sequence of events alleged by the government. At the same time, experienced defense attorneys frequently challenge cooperating witnesses by pointing to plea agreements, reduced sentencing recommendations, or other incentives that may influence their testimony. Ultimately, jurors are responsible for deciding how much weight to give each witness after hearing both direct examination and cross-examination. That process often becomes one of the most closely watched aspects of any federal conspiracy trial involving multiple defendants. Perhaps one of the government's most practical arguments concerns avoiding duplicate proceedings. Prosecutors contend that conducting separate trials would require many witnesses to return to court multiple times to discuss substantially the same events. They argue this approach would consume additional judicial resources, increase logistical challenges, and potentially expose witnesses to unnecessary risks. According to the filing, presenting all of the evidence before a single jury promotes consistency while reducing the possibility of conflicting outcomes between separate proceedings. The government believes this approach also allows jurors to evaluate the evidence in its complete context rather than hearing only selected portions of the alleged conspiracy. Whether the court agrees with that reasoning remains one of the key questions before trial preparations continue. As this closely watched federal case moves toward its next stage, both sides remain firmly committed to their positions. The defense continues arguing that the superseding indictment created unnecessary delays and complicated the original case, while prosecutors insist that every decision was supported by ongoing investigative work and established legal procedures. The judge's ruling on these motions could shape the structure of the trial and influence how evidence is ultimately presented before a jury. Regardless of the outcome, the latest filing demonstrates that neither side is backing away from an aggressive legal strategy. With extensive digital evidence, multiple cooperating witnesses, constitutional arguments, and significant procedural questions still unresolved, this case remains one of the most closely followed legal battles in hip-hop. As additional motions are filed and new rulings are issued, every development will provide further insight into how this high-profile prosecution is likely to unfold in the months ahead. That wraps up the latest update in Lil Durk's federal case, but this legal battle is far from over. As always, it's important to remember that the government's filing represents the prosecution's arguments, while the defense will have the opportunity to respond in court. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty, and the final outcome will ultimately be decided through the legal process. What do you think about this latest filing? Do you believe the judge will allow all of the charges to remain together in one trial, or do you think the defense has a strong argument for separating the case? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of your comments as possible, and I always enjoy seeing the different perspectives you bring to these discussions. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more accurate, fact-based updates on the biggest stories in hip-hop and the courtroom, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We cover the latest federal court filings, breaking rap news, industry developments, and everything happening with the biggest artists making headlines. Instead of relying on rumors or social media speculation, we focus on the actual court documents and explain what they mean in plain English. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to leave a like and share it with someone who follows hip-hop news or is keeping up with Lil Durk's case. Your support helps the channel continue bringing you timely, detailed coverage of the stories that matter most. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video with another breaking rap news update.